The first blow came cruel and sharp. "Do you feed your children with my leftovers?" the millionaire sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. Silence fell heavy in the sprawling kitchen, the words hanging like a dark cloud over the woman who had served his family for years. The echo of his cruelty bounced off the marble walls like a slap that would never fade. "I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're stirring a pot for someone who never says thank you, or wiping counters while the world around you sleeps. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise you, today's story will move you." In the heart of Chicago's Gold Coast, where Lake Michigan kissed the shore and million-dollar condominiums stretched toward heaven, stood the Richardson Tower, a monument to wealth and ambition that pierced the morning sky like a steel and glass needle. On the 42nd floor, in a penthouse worth more than most people's dreams, the kitchen hummed with the quiet efficiency of dawn. Stainless steel surfaces gleamed under recessed lighting, reflecting a world where everything was measured, calculated, and sterile. The marble countertops stretched like frozen rivers, cold to the touch, beautiful but empty of warmth. Here, in this temple of culinary perfection, ovens whispered their mechanical prayers while the automated coffee machine gurgled its morning ritual. But it wasn't the million-dollar appliances or the imported Italian fixtures that made this kitchen breathe. It was Maria Elena Vasquez, a woman whose calloused hands moved with the grace of someone who had learned to cook not from books or prestigious culinary schools, but from the desperate need to feed hearts that were hungry for more than just food. At 53, her face bore the maps of early mornings and late nights, of children raised and dreams deferred, of love poured into every meal she had ever prepared. Her graying hair was pulled back in the same simple bun she had worn for decades, and her eyes, dark as Chicago coffee, held depths of stories untold. She moved through the kitchen like a ghost made flesh, checking the temperature of rising bread dough, her fingertips testing the doneness with an intuition that no thermometer could match. The aroma of her homemade chorizo filled the air, a scent that spoke of her grandmother's kitchen in Pilsen, where tortillas were made by hand and every meal was a ceremony of love. This was her domain, though she owned none of it. This was her art, though no one called her an artist. This was her life, though most days she felt invisible. Far beyond the kitchen, through hallways lined with abstract paintings worth more than her annual salary, laughter drifted from the formal dining room. The sound was sharp and cutting, like crystal glasses clinking in celebration of deals that moved millions across continents, of stock portfolios that grew fat while others starved. Mr. James Richardson III, heir to a fortune built on Chicago real estate and venture capital investments, entertained his guests with stories of his latest acquisition, a tech startup that promised to revolutionize food delivery. His net worth, calculated in the hundreds of millions, included properties from Malibu to Manhattan, cryptocurrency holdings that fluctuated like his moods, and enough liquid assets to buy small countries. Yet for all his wealth, measured in dollars and gold, in Bitcoin and bonds, James Richardson was a man who had never tasted the flavor of contentment. His success was quantified in quarterly reports and dividend checks, but his table, despite its crystal and silver, despite its five-star presentation, remained empty of the one ingredient that money could never purchase, the seasoning of genuine care. Maria had been the silent architect of this family's daily bread for 9 years, 3 months, and 14 days. Not that anyone was counting. She arrived each morning at 4:30, when the city still slept under blankets of Lake Michigan fog, and she left after the dinner dishes were cleaned and tomorrow's breakfast was prepped. Her hands shaped masa for tamales that reminded the Richardson children of holidays past, stirred pozole that warmed their souls during Chicago's brutal winters, and crafted tres leches cake that made birthdays feel sacred. But those children were grown now, scattered to their own lives in their own kitchens, leaving behind only photographs on refrigerator doors and the echoing memory of laughter around tables that rarely saw family anymore. The irony wasn't lost on her. She, who had never owned stock in a single company, had fed those who owned pieces of the world. She, who lived in a two-bedroom apartment in Little Village, had nourished those whose wealth could purchase neighborhoods. She, whose savings account struggled to hold $5,000, had filled the bellies of those whose trust funds generated more in interest each month than she earned in a year. But Maria had learned long ago that true wealth couldn't be deposited in banks or traded on Wall Street. It lived in the calloused palms that kneaded love into bread, in the tired eyes that stayed open late to prepare one more perfect meal, in the heart that never stopped giving even when it received nothing in return. This morning was different, though she couldn't yet name why. Perhaps it was the way Mr. Richardson's voice had carried an edge sharper than her best knife when he discussed the evening's dinner party with his assistant. Perhaps it was the tension that seemed to simmer in the very air, thick as the humidity that rose from the lake in summer. Or perhaps it was simply the weight of all those years, all those invisible sacrifices pressing down on her shoulders like the heavy pots she lifted every day. As she worked, Maria whispered a prayer her mother had taught her, a blessing over the food that would soon disappear into mouths that rarely paused to consider its origin. Her Spanish mingled with the sizzle of onions hitting hot oil, creating a music that belonged to kitchens worldwide, the universal song of women who transform raw ingredients into love, who alchemy simple elements into the bread of life. This kitchen might have cost more than most houses, its appliances might have been shipped from Germany and its fixtures from France, but in her hands it became what every kitchen should be, a sanctuary where hunger was healed and souls were fed. The morning light grew stronger, painting the lake in shades of gold and silver that no amount of money could truly purchase, though many tried. And somewhere in the distance, that laughter continued, oblivious, entitled, and somehow empty despite its volume. Maria continued her work, unaware that this day would change everything, that the words she would soon hear would strip away years of dignity in a single, cruel moment. For now, there was only the rhythm of her knife against the cutting board, the whisper of steam rising from her pots, and the quiet certainty that whatever else happened in this tower of wealth and ambition, love would continue to flow from her hands into every dish she served. The story of how Maria had come to work in this tower of glass and gold began not with want ads or employment agencies, but with desperation wrapped in quiet dignity. 9 years ago, when her husband Carlos had been laid off from the steel mill and their youngest daughter needed surgery they couldn't afford, Maria had swallowed her pride and knocked on the service entrance of buildings like this one, her references written in broken English by women who cleaned offices and watched children for families who never learned their names. She remembered that first interview, standing in this very kitchen when it was still new, still smelling of fresh paint and possibility. Mrs. Richardson, James's wife then, before the cancer took her, had been kind but distant, the way wealthy people often were with those they employed. "Can you cook American food?" she had asked, and Maria had nodded, though her heart ached to share the recipes that truly lived in her hands. The job was for a kitchen assistant, they said, someone to help the head cook, to prep vegetables and clean dishes. The pay was modest but regular, and regular was what her family needed. But kitchens have a way of revealing truth, and within weeks it became clear that Maria's gifts extended far beyond chopping onions. When the head cook called in sick, Maria had quietly stepped in, preparing a simple lunch that somehow tasted like more than the sum of its parts. When little Sophie Richardson, then only 7 years old, refused to eat the elaborate meals prepared by the expensive caterers, it was Maria's quesadillas that coaxed smiles from her small face. When the family grieved Mrs. Richardson's passing 2 years later, it was Maria's chicken soup, simple, honest, healing, that provided comfort no five-star restaurant could match. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, Maria became the heart that pumped life through this mansion's veins. She learned the family's rhythms. Mr. Richardson liked his coffee black and bitter, strong enough to fuel the deals that moved millions across continents. Sophie needed extra encouragement to eat vegetables, but would devour anything Maria served if it came with a story about her grandmother in Mexico. The eldest son, Michael, only visited during holidays, but always requested Maria's tamales, claiming they were better than any restaurant in New York where he lived and worked on Wall Street. The middle daughter, Patricia, had moved to San Francisco and rarely called, but when she did, she asked if Maria could teach her how to make mole over video chat, desperate to recreate the flavors of home in her expensive California kitchen. Through seasons of grief and celebration, Maria's cooking provided the soundtrack of their lives. Her pozole welcomed New Year's, her capirotada marked somber Lenten seasons, and her tres leches cake celebrated birthdays, both joyful and obligatory. She learned to read their moods in the way they approached her food. When Mr. Richardson ate quickly, she knew business was stressing him. When Sophie played with her dinner, Maria knew school troubles were brewing. When the house felt too quiet, she would bake bread, filling the silence with warmth and the promise that someone still cared about the simple act of nourishment. But as the years passed and the Richardson fortune grew, boosted by shrewd investments in cryptocurrency and tech stocks, by real estate acquisitions that stretched from Chicago to Miami, the family seemed to grow smaller. Sophie spent more time at boarding school and summer camps, returning home like a visitor to her own life. Michael's visits became briefer, his conversations focused entirely on market fluctuations and merger opportunities. Patricia called less frequently, her life consumed by her own startup and the relentless pace of Silicon Valley success. And Mr. Richardson, surrounded by wealth that multiplied even as he slept, became more isolated, more demanding, more convinced that money could purchase anything he desired. The transformation was subtle at first. Where once he had nodded his thanks for meals well prepared, now he barely acknowledged Maria's presence. Where once he had asked about her family, now he seemed surprised to remember she had one. The kitchen, which had once felt like the warm heart of a home, began to feel more like a service station, a place where fuel was prepared for bodies that had forgotten how to appreciate the hands that fed them. Maria noticed when the grocery budget was cut, though Mr. Richardson's wine collection continued to grow. She adapted, stretching dollars like masa, making magic from simpler ingredients while listening to him boast to friends about his latest investment returns. She heard him on the phone, discussing stock options worth more than she would earn in 10 lifetimes, while expecting her to make gourmet meals on a housekeeper's allowance. The irony sat bitter in her mouth. She who created wealth in the form of nourishment and comfort was paid barely enough to nourish her own family. Yet Maria persevered, because that's what women like her did. When Sophie started high school and began bringing friends home, it was Maria who made sure they felt welcomed with homemade empanadas and fresh agua fresca. When Mr. Richardson entertained business associates, it was Maria who worked 16-hour days to ensure every detail was perfect, from appetizers that impressed to desserts that sealed deals worth millions. When holidays came and the family gathered in obligation rather than joy, it was Maria's cooking that provided the only genuine warmth in rooms full of expensive furniture and cold conversation. She watched Sophie grow from a child who delighted in helping stir pots and taste sauces into a teenager who barely looked up from her phone during meals. She saw Mr. Richardson accumulate wealth like armor, each successful deal adding another layer between himself and the world around him. She witnessed a family that had everything money could buy, slowly starving for the things that couldn't be purchased: connection, gratitude, the simple recognition of the love that showed up daily in the form of carefully prepared food. And through it all, Maria continued to cook with the same care she had brought to that first simple lunch 9 years ago. Because cooking, for her, was never about recognition or reward. It was about the sacred act of transforming raw ingredients into sustenance, of pouring love into the most basic human need. It was about the hope that somewhere, in the taste of her grandmother's recipes passed down through generations, the people she fed might remember what it felt like to be truly nourished. But hope, like hunger, can be a dangerous thing, and change, as Maria was about to learn, often comes not as gentle evolution, but as sudden, shocking revolution that strips away illusions and reveals the true nature of the relationships we think we understand. The daily humiliations came like small cuts, each one barely noticeable alone, but together creating wounds that never quite healed. They arrived disguised as casual comments, offhand remarks, and momentary lapses in what polite society called basic human decency. Maria had learned to absorb them like her aprons absorbed kitchen stains, evidence of hard work that could be washed away but never completely erased. "Maria, why does this cost so much?" Mr. Richardson would ask, waving grocery receipts in the air as if they were evidence of theft rather than proof of the care she took in selecting ingredients. She would explain quietly that organic vegetables cost more, that the free-range chicken he preferred carried a premium price, that quality olive oil was an investment in flavor. But her explanations felt thin in the face of his skepticism, as if her years of experience meant nothing compared to his Harvard MBA and his ability to move millions with a phone call. The worst part wasn't even his suspicion about money. It was his assumption that cooking was something anyone could do. "It's just throwing ingredients together," he had said once, not realizing she was within earshot. "I could hire someone for half the price to do the same thing." The words had hit her like ice water, freezing the pride that had sustained her through years of thankless service. Just throwing ingredients together, as if the intuition that knew exactly when garlic was perfectly sautéed, the timing that coordinated 6 dishes to finish simultaneously, the palate that balanced flavors like a conductor balancing an orchestra, was something that could be learned from YouTube videos and bought at minimum wage. There were the comments about her English, subtle corrections that made her feel small even when her meaning was perfectly clear. "I think you mean fewer, not less," he would say when she asked if he wanted less salt in his eggs, his tone carrying the patient condescension reserved for children and people considered intellectually inferior. Never mind that she spoke 3 languages fluently while he struggled with high school Spanish. Never mind that she could calculate recipe conversions in her head faster than he could pull out his phone calculator. In his world, accent equaled ignorance, and grammar mistakes were evidence of limited intelligence rather than the natural result of living between languages. The microaggressions multiplied like bacteria in warm places. When she requested time off for her daughter's graduation, he had asked if she was sure it was necessary, as if a mother's pride in her child's achievement was negotiable. When she needed to leave early for her own doctor's appointment, he had sighed dramatically and asked who would prepare his lunch, as if the emergency provisions she always left weren't adequate. When her arthritis flared during Chicago's brutal winter and she moved slightly slower than usual, he had made pointed comments about efficiency and productivity, as if joint pain was a choice she made to inconvenience him. But perhaps the cruelest cuts came from the casual erasure of her contributions. When guests complimented elaborate dinner parties, he accepted praise as if he had personally prepared every dish. When his friends raved about holiday meals, he would smile and nod, mentioning the catering as if Maria were an anonymous service rather than the architect of every flavor they proclaimed delicious. She would stand in the kitchen, cleaning dishes while listening to him take credit for her artistry, feeling her identity dissolve like salt in water. The children, grown now and absorbed in their own lives of privilege and possibility, had developed their father's blindness. Michael would visit from New York, bragging about his investments in cryptocurrency and tech stocks, while barely acknowledging the woman who had packed his school lunches for years. He would eat her tamales with obvious pleasure, then spend dinner discussing his latest real estate acquisition in Manhattan, without once asking how Maria's own children were doing. Patricia called from San Francisco, where her startup was worth millions on paper, requesting recipes via text message as if Maria were a cooking app rather than a human being who had helped raise her. Only Sophie, now 16, and caught between childhood and the entitled adolescence of the wealthy, showed occasional glimpses of remembering who Maria was, but even those moments were tinged with the casual cruelty of youth. She would praise Maria's cooking to friends while simultaneously complaining about the lack of trendy restaurants that delivered to their exclusive neighborhood. She would ask Maria to teach her to cook authentic Mexican food for a school project, then lose interest when she realized that authentic meant hours of grinding spices and hand-rolling tortillas rather than opening packages and following simple instructions. The isolation was perhaps worse than the disrespect. Maria worked in a house full of people who barely saw her as human, surrounded by wealth that could have solved every problem her own family faced, but was as unreachable as the stars. She watched Mr. Richardson spend more on a single bottle of wine than she earned in a week. Listened to him complain about tax obligations on his stock dividends while she calculated whether she could afford her daughter's textbooks. The mathematics of inequality played out daily in these small moments. His tips at exclusive restaurants exceeded her grocery budget. His gym membership cost more than her rent. His casual shopping sprees could have paid for her son's college tuition. Yet Maria endured, because endurance was what women like her did. She absorbed the thoughtless cruelty, the casual erasure, the daily reminders that in their world she was infrastructure rather than humanity, necessary for comfort but invisible as long as she functioned properly. She cooked with the same care, cleaned with the same thoroughness, and smiled with the same grace, even as her heart accumulated scars like her hands accumulated burns. Because somewhere beneath the humiliation and the hurt, Maria still believed in the sacred nature of her work. She still felt pride when a perfectly balanced sauce brought unexpected joy to someone's day. She still found meaning in the ancient alchemy of transforming simple ingredients into nourishment. She still held on to the hope that love, expressed through the patient preparation of food, could reach even hearts that seemed closed to everything except the accumulation of wealth and status. But hope, like dignity, can only be stretched so thin before it finally snaps. And Maria, unaware that her world was about to change catastrophically, continued her quiet work in a kitchen that gleamed with expensive surfaces, but had grown cold with years of thankless service and casual cruelty. In this atmosphere of elegant indifference, there was one bright spot that kept Maria's heart from turning completely to stone. 16-year-old Sophie Richardson, who alone among the family seemed to remember that the woman in the kitchen had feelings, dreams, and a story worth hearing. Their relationship had bloomed in the quiet moments between Sophie's scheduled activities, in the spaces where real connection could grow away from the performative demands of wealth and status. It had started when Sophie was 7, in the months following her mother's death, when grief hung over the house like Chicago fog. While Mr. Richardson buried himself in work and the older children escaped to boarding schools and extended stays with relatives, Sophie had wandered into the kitchen one afternoon. Her small face streaked with tears she couldn't explain to adults who were drowning in their own sorrow. Maria had been preparing soup, simple, honest chicken soup that filled the house with the aroma of healing, when she noticed the little girl standing in the doorway like a lost angel. "Estás triste, mi niña?" Maria had asked softly, then immediately repeated in English, "Are you sad, little one?" Sophie had nodded, unable to articulate the complex emotions of childhood grief, and Maria had done what she did best. She had fed the hurt with food made from love. A small bowl of soup, a warm tortilla torn into pieces perfect for small hands, and most importantly, patient presence that asked nothing except the privilege of witnessing a child's pain. As Sophie grew older, their afternoon kitchen sessions became sacred rituals. While her father conducted conference calls worth millions and her siblings pursued achievements that would look impressive on college applications, Sophie learned the real lessons that Maria offered: how to taste for seasoning with intuition rather than measurement, how to knead bread until it felt like silk under your hands, how to transform simple ingredients into comfort that money couldn't purchase. "Cooking isn't about following recipes," Maria would explain, as Sophie watched her prepare mole, a complex sauce that required 30 different ingredients and 3 days of patient preparation. Cooking is about listening to the sizzle that tells you oil is ready, to the bubble that says sauce is thick enough, to the smell that means bread is perfectly baked. But most important, Mija, is listening to the people you're cooking for. What do they need? What will make them happy? What will heal their hurt? Sophie absorbed these lessons like desert sand absorbs rain, desperate for wisdom that felt real in a world increasingly dominated by performance and appearance. She learned that you never rush sofrito, that the best pozole requires overnight soaking of hominy, that love was actually measurable in the time you spent stirring risotto. These were lessons not taught in the elite private school she attended, where success was quantified in test scores and college acceptances and future earning potential. In Maria, Sophie found someone who saw her as more than a Richardson heir, more than a portfolio of achievements designed to maintain family status. Maria asked about her thoughts, her fears, her dreams that had nothing to do with stock portfolios or trust funds. She listened when Sophie worried about friends who seemed to value her only for the parties her family could throw and the connections her father could provide. She offered comfort when Sophie struggled with the isolation of wealth, the burden of being surrounded by luxury, but starved for authentic connection. "Money is like salt, Michi," Maria had told her one afternoon as they prepared empanadas together, Sophie's inexperienced hands creating lopsided pockets of dough while Maria's moved with practiced grace. "A little bit makes everything taste better, but too much ruins the whole dish. Your family has been oversalted, I think. They've forgotten what food tastes like without it." These conversations took place in whispers, in the private language of kitchen confidences, where real truths could be spoken safely. Sophie learned about Maria's own children, Rosa, who worked as a nurse and sent money home every month, Miguel, who studied engineering while working nights to pay for school, Carmen, the youngest, whose artistic talent bloomed despite limited resources. She heard stories of Maria's childhood in Mexico, of grandmother who taught her that every meal was a prayer, of coming to America with nothing but hopes and recipes, passed down through generations of women who understood that feeding others was the highest form of service. Through Maria's eyes, Sophie began to see the world differently. She noticed how her father spoke to service workers, how her friends treated restaurant servers, how her family's wealth created invisible barriers between them, and the humanity of those who made their comfort possible. She began to understand that the woman who had nurtured her through childhood, who had celebrated her achievements and comforted her disappointments, was valued less than the monthly payment on her father's sports car. The injustice of it burned in Sophie's chest like heartburn, a constant reminder that the world was constructed in ways that didn't make moral sense. Maria worked harder than anyone she knew, possessed skills that took decades to master, and contributed more to the family's daily happiness than any of her father's business associates. Yet she lived paycheck to paycheck while they accumulated wealth that grew even as they slept. "Why doesn't Papa pay you more?" Sophie had asked one day, her 16-year-old sense of justice outraged by realities she was just beginning to understand. Maria had smiled sadly, her hands never pausing in their work preparing fresh tortillas. "Because he doesn't see what I do as work, mija. He sees it as service, like the electricity or the water. It's just there, helping his life run smoothly, and you don't think about paying more for electricity just because it works very well." Sophie wanted to argue, wanted to storm into her father's office and demand justice, wanted to use her voice and her privilege to change things immediately. But Maria, with the wisdom of years and the patience of mothers everywhere, taught her that change came slowly, like bread rising or soup simmering. Someday, when you have your own kitchen, you'll remember these lessons. You'll know how to value the people who serve you with love. That's enough for now. But it wasn't enough for Sophie, whose sense of fairness was still sharp enough to recognize injustice even when it benefited her. She began to push back in small ways, thanking Maria loudly when her father was present, praising her cooking to friends and family, insisting on helping with preparations even when she had homework or social obligations. She started paying attention to how much her family spent on things they didn't need compared to what they paid the person who made their daily life possible. These afternoon kitchen sessions became Sophie's anchor in a world that often felt artificial and cold. While her classmates competed for admission to Ivy League schools and internships at their parents' investment firms, Sophie found her truest education in learning to make tamales from scratch, in understanding the patience required to develop deep flavors, in discovering that the most valuable knowledge often came from people the world overlooked, but their special relationship also made the daily humiliations Maria faced more painful for Sophie to witness. She saw how her father dismissed Maria's requests, how he questioned her expenses while spending thousands on wine he claimed to need for business entertainment. She heard the casual cruelty in his comments, the way he spoke about Maria as if she were furniture that had become inconvenient, and she began to understand that their kitchen sanctuary existed in defiance of her family's values, a pocket of authentic humanity in a house built on the belief that money could purchase everything, including the right to treat others as less than human. The lessons Sophie learned from Maria would stay with her forever. But she was about to discover that knowledge and privilege don't always translate into power to protect the people you love. Change was coming to their house, arriving in the form of ambition and ego, and the kind of casual cruelty that wealthy people often mistake for efficiency. And Sophie, despite her love and her growing awareness, was about to learn that sometimes being unable to prevent injustice is its own special kind of heartbreak. The change arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, when autumn painted Chicago's lakefront in shades of gold and amber, and the Richardson kitchen hummed with its usual quiet efficiency. Maria was preparing her famous butternut squash soup, the recipe perfected through years of subtle adjustments, when Mr. Richardson swept into the kitchen accompanied by a stranger whose presence immediately altered the room's atmosphere like a sudden drop in barometric pressure. "Maria," Mr. Richardson announced without preamble, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of someone who believed he was solving problems rather than creating them. "I want you to meet Chef Louis Beaumont. He'll be heading our kitchen operations from now on. Louis, this is Maria. She's been helping out here for several years." Helping out. 9 years of dedicated service reduced to casual assistance, as if her contribution to the family's daily life was equivalent to occasional babysitting or holiday decorating. Maria felt the words hit her chest like cold air, but she maintained her composure, wiping her hands on her apron before extending one to the newcomer. "Mucho gusto," she said, then corrected herself. "Nice to meet you." Chef Louis Beaumont was everything Maria was not. Tall where she was compact, pale where she was golden, confident where she had learned to be invisible. His whites were pristine and pressed, his knives gleamed in expensive leather rolls, and his credentials hung around him like armor. Culinary Institute of America, stages at Le Bernardin and the French Laundry, James Beard nominations, Michelin stars accumulated like military medals. He looked at Maria's simple setup, her well-worn wooden spoons, her grandmother's molcajete, her handwritten recipe card stained with years of use, with the barely concealed condescension of someone who had never learned that technique could live in humble tools. "Pleasure," Louis replied, his handshake brief and perfunctory, his attention already turning to catalog the kitchen's equipment and judge its worthiness for his sophisticated palate. He moved through the space like a general surveying conquered territory, opening drawers, examining pantry contents, making mental notes that felt like criticisms. Mr. Richardson beamed with the satisfaction of someone who had just made a purchase he believed would increase both his status and his investment portfolio. "Louis comes to us from Le Bernardin in New York. His molecular gastronomy techniques are absolutely cutting edge. We're planning to start a dinner series for my business associates, intimate meals that will help close deals worth millions. This kitchen is going to become a real asset to our operations." Maria felt something twist in her chest at the word asset, as if the kitchen where she had poured her heart for nearly a decade was just another commodity to be optimized for profit. But she remained silent, continuing to stir her soup while listening to plans that seemed to erase her existence as thoroughly as if she had never been there at all. "We'll need to modernize the pantry completely," Louis was saying, his French accent lending authority to every word. "Molecular gastronomy requires very specific ingredients, liquid nitrogen, agar-agar, various hydrocolloids, and we'll need specialized equipment, immersion circulators, rotary evaporators, ultrasonic baths. The investment will be substantial, but the results will justify every penny." Thousands of dollars in new equipment to create food that looked like art but tasted like science experiments, while Maria created daily miracles with tools she'd bought herself from discount stores in Pilsen. She watched them discuss budgets that exceeded what she earned in years, planning meals that would impress rather than nourish, designing experiences that prioritized spectacle over the simple human need for comfort and sustenance. "What about traditional cooking methods?" Sophie asked, appearing in the kitchen doorway with perfect timing, her voice carrying an edge that made Maria both proud and nervous. At 16, Sophie had inherited the Richardson directness, but hadn't yet learned to temper it with diplomatic caution. Louis turned to her with the kind of smile adults reserve for children whose opinions don't matter. "Traditional methods have their place, of course, but modern diners expect innovation. Molecular gastronomy allows us to break down the barriers between chemistry and cuisine, to create experiences that challenge preconceptions and expand palates." "But what if people just want food that tastes good?" Sophie pressed, her loyalty to Maria evident in every word. "What if they want to feel cared for instead of impressed?" "Sophie," Mr. Richardson interrupted, his tone carrying warning, "Chef Beaumont is a professional with years of training. I think we can trust his expertise." Maria felt the familiar sting of dismissal, but sharper this time because it extended to Sophie's legitimate questions. In the world of wealth and status, credentials trumped wisdom, formal training overshadowed intuitive knowledge, and innovation was valued more than the ancient art of transforming simple ingredients into love made edible. Over the following weeks, Maria watched her kitchen transform from sanctuary to laboratory. Specialized equipment arrived in boxes marked with prices that made her stomach clench, single tools that cost more than her monthly salary, ingredients with names she couldn't pronounce that required refrigeration systems more complex than her entire apartment's electrical grid. The warm aromas of her traditional cooking were replaced by the sterile scents of chemicals and the hiss of liquid nitrogen, creating clouds of theatrical smoke. Louis treated her with the polite indifference reserved for outdated equipment that hasn't yet been disposed of. He assigned her tasks, chopping vegetables, washing dishes, maintaining inventory, that reduced her from chef to assistant, from artist to laborer. Her recipes were dismissed as rustic and unsophisticated, her techniques labeled as inconsistent and unscientific. The sofrito that had taken her years to perfect was replaced by precisely measured flavor compounds. The pozole that had comforted this family through winters and sorrows was deemed too heavy for sophisticated palates. But the cruelest cut came in watching how quickly the family adapted to the change, how eagerly they embraced the prestige of having a real chef in their kitchen. Mr. Richardson bragged to business associates about his culinary acquisition, describing Louis as if he were a stock that was sure to appreciate in value. Michael called from New York to ask about the famous chef he'd heard was now running their kitchen, never once asking what had happened to Maria. Patricia requested photos of Louis's creations to share on her social media, where molecular gastronomy represented the kind of cultural sophistication that impressed her Silicon Valley circles. Even Sophie, despite her initial protests, found herself drawn into the novelty of dishes that smoked and changed colors, that challenged her understanding of how food could behave. Maria watched from the periphery as Sophie asked Louis questions about his techniques, fascinated by the science that could transform olive oil into caviar-like spheres or create chocolate that dissolved into unexpected flavors. The kitchen sessions they had shared, those sacred afternoons of learning and connection, were displaced by the excitement of culinary innovation. Maria continued to arrive at 4:30 each morning, continued to perform her assigned tasks with the same careful attention she had always brought to her work. But she felt herself becoming invisible, a ghost haunting a kitchen that no longer recognized her presence. The tools she had used for years were packed away to make room for Louis's specialized equipment. The recipes she had perfected through years of subtle adjustment were replaced by formulas calculated to the gram. The intuitive knowledge she had developed through decades of cooking was dismissed as inconsistent and unreliable. The house still needed her labor, still required her hands to chop and clean and organize, but it no longer valued her heart, her creativity, her love. She had become what she had always feared, just another appliance in a kitchen full of expensive machines, necessary for function, but invisible except when something went wrong. And something was about to go very, very wrong. The catastrophe struck on a Saturday evening in November when Lake Michigan's wind carried the bitter promise of winter, and the Richardson penthouse glowed with the warm light of what was supposed to be a triumph. Mr. Richardson had organized an intimate dinner party for 8 of his most important business associates, men whose collective net worth could have funded small countries, whose handshake agreements moved billions across continents, whose approval could mean the difference between success and failure in Chicago's most exclusive investment circles. The guest list read like a who's who of American capitalism. Jonathan Hartwell, whose hedge fund managed pension funds for half the Midwest. Robert Chen, whose tech acquisitions had made him one of the youngest billionaires in Silicon Valley. Margaret Thornfield, whose real estate empire stretched from Manhattan to Miami. David Kozlov, whose cryptocurrency holdings had multiplied faster than compound interest. These were people accustomed to the finest things money could buy, whose palates had been educated in the world's most exclusive restaurants, whose expectations could not be disappointed without consequences that rippled through social and financial networks. Chef Louis had spent weeks planning the menu, designing what he called a molecular journey through American terroir with French technique. Each course was calculated not just for flavor, but for the kind of Instagram-worthy presentation that would generate social media buzz worth millions in unpaid marketing. Deconstructed Chicago deep dish pizza transformed into foam and crisp, Lake Superior whitefish prepared using liquid nitrogen to create table-side theater, locally sourced corn reimagined as edible silk ribbons that dissolved into childhood memories of summer. The kitchen buzzed with military precision as the day approached. Louis had hired additional staff for the evening, sous chefs from top restaurants, service personnel trained in the theatrical presentation his cuisine required. Maria found herself pushed further to the periphery, assigned to basic prep work and cleanup duties, while the real cooking happened around specialized equipment she wasn't trusted to operate. She watched Louis orchestrate his team like a conductor leading a symphony, his movements sharp and confident, his commands delivered with the authority of someone who had never doubted his right to lead. Every element was timed to the second, every component measured to the gram, every presentation angle calculated for maximum visual impact. This was cooking as performance art, cuisine as investment strategy, food as social positioning. But Maria, with her decades of intuitive knowledge, noticed things that Louis's technical precision had overlooked. The liquid nitrogen tank's pressure gauge flickered inconsistently. The molecular additives had been stored at temperatures that might affect their stability. The timing was so precise that there was no buffer for the inevitable small delays that real cooking always requires. She mentioned her concerns quietly to one of the sous chefs, but her observations were dismissed as the unnecessary worry of someone who didn't understand modern techniques. As the guests arrived and took their seats in the formal dining room, a space that showcased Mr. Richardson's art collection and offered stunning views of Lake Michigan's moonlit surface, the kitchen approached the critical moment when all of Louis's preparation would be tested by reality. The first course went out perfectly, earning the kind of appreciative murmurs that signaled social and financial success. The second course impressed with its theatrical liquid nitrogen clouds and unexpected flavor transformations. Then everything went wrong at once. The third course, the centerpiece of the evening, a dish that reimagined traditional Chicago Italian beef as molecular spheres that burst with concentrated flavor, required precise timing between three separate molecular processes. The liquid nitrogen system malfunctioned just as the spherification process reached its critical moment. The temperature-sensitive hydrocolloids began to break down under the kitchen's heat and Louis's mounting stress. What should have been perfect spheres of concentrated beef essence became a runny, unappetizing mess that looked like failed science experiment rather than culinary innovation. Louis's composure cracked like an egg hitting concrete. He screamed at his team in French, his accent thickening with panic as he realized that his reputation was disintegrating along with his molecular spheres. The backup plan required ingredients that weren't available, techniques that couldn't be improvised in the time remaining. The guests sat in the dining room, their conversations growing stilted as they waited for a course that would never arrive in edible form. In that moment of chaos and professional catastrophe, Louis made the decision that wealthy people often make when their failures require explanation. He found someone else to blame. His eyes scanned the kitchen and landed on Maria, who stood quietly by the prep station, her face reflecting concern for a disaster she had anticipated but been powerless to prevent. "This is sabotage," Louis declared, his voice carrying across the kitchen like an accusation that would destroy lives. "Someone has tampered with my equipment, compromised my ingredients. This kind of failure doesn't happen by accident." The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of refrigeration and the distant murmur of guests growing increasingly uncomfortable in the dining room. All eyes turned to Maria, the only person present who had been excluded from Louis's inner circle, the only one who might harbor resentment sufficient for sabotage. The mathematics of blame pointed directly at her. She had motive, access, and the knowledge necessary to cause exactly this kind of catastrophic failure. Mr. Richardson stormed into the kitchen, his face flushed with embarrassment and fury. His investment in culinary prestige was collapsing before his eyes, his reputation being diminished with every minute his guests sat waiting for food that wouldn't come. Years of building trust and social capital were evaporating like liquid nitrogen in warm air. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone whose wealth usually insulated him from such public humiliation. Louis pointed directly at Maria, his accusation delivered with the certainty of someone who had found a convenient target for his professional failure. "She sabotaged the equipment. Look at her. She's been resentful ever since I arrived, jealous of being replaced by real professional techniques. This is revenge." Maria felt the words hit her like physical blows, each accusation stripping away years of trusted service, of quiet dignity, of love poured into every meal she had ever prepared for this family. She opened her mouth to defend herself, to explain her concerns about the equipment, to offer her help in salvaging the evening. But Mr. Richardson's face had already hardened into judgment, his mind made up before she could speak. And then came the words that would haunt both of them forever, the casual cruelty that revealed how he truly saw her after 9 years of faithful service. "Do you feed your children with my leftovers?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a kitchen fire, poisonous and inescapable. He was suggesting that she stole food, that her poverty made her a thief, that her need to feed her own family made her capable of sabotaging his business relationships. The insult struck her not just as an individual, but as a mother, as a woman who had sacrificed her own comfort to ensure others were nourished, as a person whose entire identity was built on the sacred act of feeding others with love rather than taking from them with greed. The kitchen fell completely silent, the only sound the soft hiss of the malfunctioning equipment that had created this disaster. Maria felt her dignity crumble like old bread, her carefully maintained composure finally breaking under the weight of such breathtaking injustice. Tears slipped down her cheeks, not just from hurt, but from the crushing realization that 9 years of service, of care, of love expressed through food had been reduced to this moment of casual cruelty and false accusation. With shaking hands, she untied her apron, the simple cotton apron she had worn for nearly a decade, now stained with the evidence of countless meals prepared with devotion. She placed it carefully on the counter where she had chopped vegetables every morning at dawn, where she had kneaded bread with hands that never stopped giving, where she had created daily miracles from simple ingredients and boundless love. Without a word, because no words could adequately respond to such injustice, Maria walked toward the kitchen service entrance. Her footsteps echoed in the silence like a funeral march for trust betrayed, for service unvalued, for love unrewarded. Behind her, she left more than just a job. She left the family she had nourished through grief and celebration, the kitchen that had been her canvas for artistic expression, the daily purpose that had given meaning to her early mornings and late nights. Mr. Richardson watched her go with the satisfaction of someone who believed he had solved a problem efficiently, not realizing he had just lost the heart and soul of his home. Louis began barking orders to salvage what remained of the evening, not understanding that no amount of technical skill could replace what had just walked out the door. Only Sophie, watching from the hallway where she had witnessed the entire disaster, understood that something precious and irreplaceable had just been destroyed by cruelty disguised as authority, by prejudice masquerading as justice. She wanted to run after Maria, to apologize for her family's blindness, to beg her not to leave. But at 16, she possessed awareness without power, understanding without authority, love without the ability to protect the person who had taught her what love looked like in daily practice. The kitchen door closed behind Maria with a soft click that sounded like the end of everything good and genuine in a house that had forgotten how to value what truly mattered. In the weeks that followed Maria's departure, the Richardson house began to experience a peculiar kind of starvation, not of food, but of soul. The kitchen still hummed with expensive equipment, still produced elaborate meals designed to impress rather than nourish, but something essential had vanished from its stainless steel heart, leaving behind a sterile space that functioned without feeling, that fed bodies while allowing spirits to grow thin with hunger. Chef Louis continued his molecular experiments with technical precision, creating dishes that photographed beautifully and impressed guests with their innovation. But Mr. Richardson found himself eating mechanically, his meals tasting of chemistry rather than care, of technique rather than tenderness. The food satisfied his physical hunger, but left him feeling oddly unsatisfied, as if he were consuming nutrition without nourishment, calories without comfort. Sophie stopped eating dinner in the formal dining room, claiming homework demanded her attention. In reality, she couldn't bear to sit at the table where Louis's creations were praised, while Maria's absence went unmentioned, as if 9 years of devoted service could be erased as easily as cleaning a plate. She survived on delivered pizza and sandwiches made in the small kitchenette near her bedroom, foods that at least didn't mock her memories of meals prepared with love. The house itself seemed to reflect the absence. Conversations became more stilted, laughter more forced, family dinners more like business meetings where nutritional requirements were met with efficient indifference. The kitchen, once the warm heart that pumped life through the mansion's veins, became just another room where transactions occurred. Ingredients transformed into presentations, money exchanged for temporary satisfaction that left deeper hungers unaddressed. Michael called from New York less frequently, claiming work demands, but actually finding excuses to avoid visiting a home that no longer felt like home. When he did visit, he ate Louis's elaborate creations with polite appreciation, but always left early, his childhood memories of comfort clashing with the current reality of culinary performance art. The tamales he had once craved were now just a nostalgic memory, replaced by deconstructed versions that contained all the original ingredients, but none of the love that had made the original irreplaceable. Patricia video-called from San Francisco, her tech startup consuming her time and attention, but she too felt the absence without being able to name it. She requested recipes from Louis, hoping to recreate impressive dishes for her own entertaining, but his complex formulas requiring specialized equipment left her frustrated and disconnected from the simple act of preparing food for people she cared about. The mole recipe she had once pleaded with Maria to teach her remained unlearned. The knowledge lost with the teacher who had been dismissed as replaceable. Mr. Richardson threw himself into work with increased intensity, his deals becoming more aggressive, his acquisition of wealth more compulsive. But success felt hollow in ways he couldn't articulate. Business dinners at the Penthouse impressed associates with their culinary theater, but closed fewer deals than meetings held at restaurants where food carried the warmth of genuine hospitality. His home, despite its expensive renovations and professional staff, felt more like a hotel, luxurious but temporary, impressive but unloved. The seasonal rhythms that Maria had honored disappeared entirely. There were no special preparations for holidays, no comfort foods during Chicago's brutal winter, no celebration meals that marked family milestones with flavors that carried memory and meaning. Louis cooked according to ingredient availability and aesthetic inspiration, but never according to the emotional calendar that had once made the Richardson kitchen a sanctuary for hearts that needed healing. Sleep came harder to Mr. Richardson as winter deepened over Lake Michigan. He found himself wandering the house at night, unconsciously drawn to the kitchen, where he would stand among the gleaming appliances, feeling profoundly alone despite being surrounded by luxury. The silence where Maria's early morning preparations had once provided rhythm and comfort now felt oppressive, a reminder of something important that had been lost through his own cruel certainty. Dreams brought unwanted memories of meals past, the chicken soup that had comforted him during his wife's illness, the birthday cakes that had made celebrations feel sacred, the simple sandwiches prepared with care that had sustained him through late business meetings. He began to realize that Maria's cooking had been the thread that connected his family's present to their past, that wove memory and tradition into daily experience, that transformed the business of eating into the sacrament of sharing life. But pride is a powerful drug, and Mr. Richardson had been addicted to it for years. Rather than confronting the possibility that he had made a terrible mistake, he doubled down on justifying his decision. He told himself that Louis's cuisine was objectively superior, more sophisticated, more appropriate for a man of his status. He convinced himself that Maria's departure had been inevitable, that outgrowing her simple cooking was a natural progression of his family's rising social position. Yet, the mathematics of satisfaction refused to support his rationalizations. For all its technical complexity, Louis's food left him feeling empty. For all its visual impressiveness, it carried no emotional weight. For all its innovation, it connected him to nothing beyond the moment of consumption. He was eating more expensively than ever before, but feeling less nourished than he had in years. The turning point came on a February evening when Chicago's wind howled across the lake with particular viciousness, and Mr. Richardson sat in his formal dining room eating Louis's latest creation, a deconstructed beef stew that separated all the traditional components into artful arrangements that required assembly before each bite. The dish was technically perfect, visually stunning, and completely unsatisfying in ways that transcended taste or texture. As he ate, he found himself remembering the beef stew Maria used to prepare on nights exactly like this one. Simple, honest, warming food that filled the house with aromas that promised safety and comfort. Her stew had required no assembly, no explanation, no intellectual appreciation. It had simply nourished, the way food was meant to nourish, connecting him to traditions of warmth and care that stretched back generations. For the first time since that disastrous November evening, Mr. Richardson allowed himself to consider the possibility that he had been wrong. Not just mistaken in his accusation, though that was becoming increasingly clear as the kitchen continued to function without sabotage, but fundamentally wrong about what constituted value, about what made food meaningful, about what his family had actually lost when Maria walked out of their lives. The revelation was as bitter as the winter wind outside, and twice as chilling. The truth emerged like spring after Chicago's brutal winter, gradually, then suddenly, with the inexorable power of seasons changing, despite human attempts to control natural rhythms. It arrived in the form of Henri Dubois, one of Louis' sous chefs, whose guilt had been growing heavier with each passing day since the disastrous November dinner party. Henri was young, barely 25, trained at Johnson & Wales, but still learning the harsh realities of professional kitchen culture where blame flowed downhill like spilled sauce. He had watched the disaster unfold that night, had seen the equipment malfunction that caused Louis' molecular spheres to collapse into unappetizing failure, and had remained silent when his chef chose to blame Maria rather than accept responsibility for a technique too complex for the available technology. But silence, Henri discovered, was a weight that grew heavier with time. Each day he worked in the Richardson kitchen. Each time he saw Louis accept praise for dishes that succeeded where Maria was given no credit for her contributions. Each moment he witnessed the family adapting to their soulless new reality. His complicity in an innocent woman's destruction gnawed at his conscience like hunger gnaws at an empty stomach. The breaking point came on a gray March morning when Henri was preparing vegetables for Louis' latest innovation, a traditional chicken soup reconstructed using spherification techniques that would transform simple broth into edible caviar, bread into foam, vegetables into textured proteins that challenged every assumption about comfort food. As he worked, he found himself thinking about his own grandmother in Louisiana, whose gumbo had never needed molecular intervention to heal hearts and fill souls. That afternoon, while Louis was away consulting with vendors about new equipment that would cost more than most families' annual income, Henri approached Sophie, who was doing homework in the breakfast nook that overlooked Lake Michigan's restless gray waters. She had grown thinner since November, he noticed, her features sharper with the kind of hunger that proper nutrition couldn't address. "Miss Richardson," he began, his voice carrying the tremor of someone about to cross a line from which there would be no return. "I need to tell you something about what happened that night in November, about Maria." Sophie looked up from her textbooks, and Henri saw in her eyes the desperate hope of someone who had been waiting for exactly this conversation, who had never believed in Maria's guilt, but had lacked the power to prove her innocence. "What about Maria?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled despite the emotion underlying each word. Henri took a breath that seemed to draw in courage from the kitchen air that still occasionally carried the ghost of Maria's presence. "She didn't sabotage anything. The equipment failed because Louis pushed it beyond its specifications, because he was so focused on impressing your father's guests that he ignored the technical limitations. I tried to tell him the liquid nitrogen system was unstable, but he wouldn't listen. When everything went wrong, he needed someone to blame. And Maria was—" Henri paused, searching for words that could capture the casual cruelty of what had transpired. "She was convenient," Sophie finished, her voice flat with the kind of understanding that comes from witnessing injustice too clearly to deny it. "She was powerless, so she made a perfect target." Henri nodded, relief and shame warring in his expression. "I should have spoken up that night. I should have told the truth instead of letting an innocent woman take the blame for our failure. But I was afraid of losing my job, afraid of being blacklisted in the industry. I chose my career over doing what was right, and I've regretted it every day since." The conversation that followed was interrupted several times as Henri struggled with emotions he hadn't expected. Grief for his own moral failure, anger at the system that made such cowardice seem rational, desperate hope that some form of justice might still be possible even months after the original injustice. Sophie listened with the intensity of someone receiving information that could change everything, her questions sharp and focused despite the tears that slipped down her cheeks. When Louis returned from his vendor meetings, Henri was waiting with resignation letter in hand, and truth finally ready to be spoken. The confrontation was brief but definitive, Louis tried to dismiss the confession as the jealous lies of a disgruntled employee, but Henri's specific knowledge of the equipment failure made denial impossible. Faced with the choice between admitting his failure or allowing his lie to stand, Louis chose the coward's path. He packed his expensive knives and left the Richardson kitchen that very evening, disappearing into the anonymous world of high-end restaurant culture where professional failures could be reinvented as creative differences. Sophie found her father in his study that evening, surrounded by financial reports and investment prospectuses that suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the moral accounting that needed to occur. Mr. Richardson listened to Henri's confession with the growing horror of someone realizing that his own cruelty had been built on lies, that his certainty had been misplaced, that his actions had destroyed an innocent woman's livelihood and dignity based on nothing more substantial than convenient prejudice. The silence that followed Sophie's recitation of the truth was heavier than the November silence that had followed Maria's departure. Mr. Richardson sat behind his leather-topped desk, surrounded by the symbols of his financial success, and felt the burden of wealth for the first time in his life, not its privileges, but its responsibility, not its power, but its potential for causing harm when wielded without wisdom or compassion. Financial calculations had always come easily to him: profit and loss, risk assessment, return on investment. But the moral mathematics of his treatment of Maria proved more complex than any portfolio analysis. How do you calculate the value of 9 years of faithful service? How do you measure the worth of love expressed through daily preparation of nourishing food? How do you quantify the damage done by false accusation and casual cruelty? For the first time since his wife's death, James Richardson III found himself crying, not from grief this time, but from shame that cut deeper than any financial loss he had ever experienced. His wealth, accumulated through decades of shrewd investments and careful deal-making, suddenly felt like a weight that had separated him from his own humanity, that had convinced him that economic superiority translated into moral authority. That night, he lay awake calculating not market fluctuations or merger possibilities, but the true cost of his treatment of Maria, not in dollars which were meaningless, but in dignity destroyed, trust betrayed, and love rejected. His cryptocurrency holdings might fluctuate wildly, his stock portfolio might rise and fall with market forces, but the investment he had destroyed through his cruelty, 9 years of faithful service from a woman who had asked for nothing more than basic respect, that was a loss that couldn't be recovered through financial maneuvering. The magnitude of his mistake settled over him like Lake Michigan fog, obscuring the familiar landmarks of his justified existence and leaving him lost in a moral landscape where his usual navigational tools, money, status, social position, proved useless. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, James Richardson found himself truly hungry, not for food, but for the kind of nourishment that only comes from right relationship, from justice served, from love acknowledged and honored. But wanting to make amends and knowing how to make them are different problems entirely. And finding Maria, Mr. Richardson was about to discover, would prove easier than finding the words to ask for forgiveness from someone whose trust he had so thoroughly and carelessly destroyed. The search for Maria began with the kind of systematic approach that James Richardson applied to all his business ventures, but quickly revealed the limits of wealth when confronted with the complex geography of urban poverty and immigrant resilience. Private investigators, hired with the casual expenditure that characterized his approach to problems, returned with fragments of information that painted a picture of a woman who had been absorbed back into Chicago's vast network of invisible workers, her life resuming patterns that had existed long before she entered the Richardson orbit. She was volunteering at St. Augustine's Community Center in Pilsen, teaching cooking classes to single mothers who struggled to feed their families on food stamp budgets. She was working part-time at Los Compadres, a family restaurant on 18th Street, where her reputation for authentic flavors had attracted a loyal following of customers who appreciated food prepared with care rather than molecular innovation. She was living again in the small apartment in Little Village where she had raised her children, where neighbors knew her story and offered both shelter and support, without the complicated dynamics of employer-employee relationships. But finding Maria and approaching her proved to be separate challenges entirely. The first required only money and persistence. The second required something James Richardson had spent decades avoiding: genuine vulnerability, authentic remorse, and the willingness to face someone he had wronged without the protective buffer of wealth and social position. It was Sophie who finally made contact possible. Using her 16-year-old's combination of determination and charm to appear at St. Augustine's on a Saturday morning when Maria was teaching a dozen women how to stretch grocery budgets through traditional dishes that transformed inexpensive ingredients into nourishing meals. Sophie sat quietly in the back of the community center's small kitchen, watching Maria demonstrate the patient process of making pozole from scratch, her hands moving with the same grace they had shown in the Richardson penthouse, but now serving women who understood the value of every technique, every shortcut, every method for making food stretch further while maintaining dignity and flavor. After the class ended and the women dispersed with containers of leftover pozole and printed recipes modified for their specific budgets and family sizes, Maria turned to Sophie with the expression that mixed wariness with the residual affection that comes from years of shared kitchen confidences. "Mija," she said softly, "you shouldn't be here. Your father wouldn't approve." "My father sent me," Sophie replied, which was technically true, though incomplete. "He wants to see you. He knows the truth about what happened that night. He knows you were innocent." Maria's face closed, like a door being shut against winter wind. Knowledge of her innocence, after months of carrying the burden of false accusation, was gratifying but insufficient. "Knowing and believing are different things, Sophie. Your father believed I was capable of sabotage because he wanted to believe it. When it was convenient to blame someone powerless, he chose cruelty over justice. Why should I trust him now?" The question hung in the air of the community center kitchen, which smelled of the simple, honest cooking that had always been Maria's gift. No molecular innovations required, no expensive equipment necessary, just the ancient alchemy of transforming basic ingredients into nourishment through patience and care. Sophie struggled to find words that could bridge the gap between her father's newfound remorse and Maria's entirely justified wariness. "Because he's miserable," Sophie finally said, choosing honesty over diplomacy. "Because the house feels dead without you. Because he finally understands what we lost when you left. Because he wants to make it right, even though he doesn't know how." Maria studied Sophie's face, reading in her features the months of grief and anger that had followed November's disaster. "And what do you want, Mija? What do you hope will happen if I agree to see your father?" "I want our family back," Sophie admitted, tears threatening but held in check by force of will. "I want the kitchen to feel alive again. I want him to remember how to value people who love us instead of just people who can make him money. I want you to get the apology you deserve and the respect you've always earned." The simplicity of Sophie's desire struck Maria like recognition of her own younger self when solutions seemed possible through sincerity and love expressed through action. But experience had taught her that damage, once done, couldn't always be undone through good intentions. Trust, once broken, required more than regret to repair. "Tell your father," Maria said finally, "that if he wants to see me, he can come here, to this kitchen, where I teach women who understand the value of what I do, not to some fancy restaurant where he controls the environment, not to his house where he has all the power. Here, where the playing field is level and the conversation can be honest." Sophie nodded, understanding intuitively that Maria's terms weren't about revenge or punishment, but about dignity. The need to meet as equals rather than as employer and employee, as human beings rather than as roles in an economic relationship that had proven so easily corrupted by assumptions about power and worth. The message delivered to James Richardson that evening struck him with unexpected force. His first instinct was to negotiate the terms, to suggest a neutral location that would feel less like supplication and more like business meeting. But Sophie's recounting of Maria's quiet dignity, her willingness to meet it all despite having every reason to refuse, gradually penetrated his businessman's instinct for controlling negotiations. This wasn't a merger to be orchestrated or an acquisition to be managed. This was a reckoning with his own capacity for cruelty, a chance to face the human cost of his assumptions about power and privilege. Maria's choice of location wasn't punishment. It was an opportunity for him to see her in her element, to understand what she did when she wasn't serving his family, to appreciate the full scope of the gifts he had dismissed as anyone can cook. 3 days later, James Richardson stood outside St. Augustine's Community Center on a Thursday evening, his expensive suit and luxury car marking him as clearly foreign to the neighborhood as if he had worn a sign announcing his net worth. The building was humble compared to the institutions that usually housed his meetings, community spaces where success was measured in families fed rather than dollars earned, where influence meant the ability to teach skills rather than the power to control markets. Inside, he found Maria exactly where Sophie had said she would be, teaching an evening class to women who worked multiple jobs and still struggled to feed their families nutritious meals on impossible budgets. He watched from the doorway as she demonstrated how to make a week's worth of lunches from ingredients that cost less than what he typically spent on a single glass of wine, her hands moving with practiced efficiency, while her voice carried patience and encouragement rather than judgment or condescension. When the class ended and the women gathered their containers and recipe cards, chatting in Spanish and English about modifications for picky children and strategies for stretching ingredients even further, Maria finally approached the man who had once held such power over her daily life. But here, in her element, serving people who valued her knowledge, she seemed taller somehow, more substantial, as if his dismissal of her had been revealed as a failure of his perception rather than a reflection of her worth. "Mr. Richardson," she said simply, wiping her hands on a towel that had seen thousands of such moments. "Sophie said you wanted to talk." The words he had practiced on the drive over, carefully crafted apologies, businesslike acknowledgments of error, offers of compensation that would demonstrate his sincerity through financial generosity, all seemed inadequate in the face of a woman whose dignity had survived his assault and whose purpose had transcended his ability to destroy it. Standing in a community kitchen that smelled of community and care, James Richardson found himself as speechless as he had been cruel 4 months earlier. But silence, this time, was the beginning of understanding rather than the end of it. The reunion began not with words, but with the simplest, most fundamental act that had once connected them, the sharing of food prepared with intention and offered without expectation. Maria gestured toward a small table in the community center's kitchen, where she had set out bowls of the pozole she had made during the evening's class, accompanied by fresh tortillas and the kind of simple salsa that transformed basic ingredients into brightness through perfect balance of flavors. "Eat," she said, the word carrying echoes of countless meals she had prepared for the Richardson family, but also something new, an invitation offered as equals rather than a service provided by employee to employer. "We'll talk after." James Richardson found himself sitting at a folding table that cost less than his monthly wine budget, eating from ceramic bowls that would have been dismissed as inadequate in his penthouse dining room, but discovering flavors that carried more complexity and satisfaction than any of Lewis's molecular creations. The pozole was everything his sophisticated palate had been missing: honest, warming, substantial food that nourished both body and spirit with each spoonful. As he ate, Maria busied herself cleaning the kitchen, her movements carrying the familiar rhythm he had watched for years but never truly appreciated. The efficiency wasn't just professional, it was artistic. the way she transformed chaos back into order, the way she left every surface better than she had found it, the way she honored the tools and space that allowed her to create nourishment for others. "This is what I do now," she said without preamble as she finished wiping down counters. "I teach women how to feed their families with dignity when money is scarce. I show them that good food doesn't require expensive ingredients, just knowledge and care and respect for the people you're feeding." The implicit contrast with his assumptions hung unspoken but clear. She had chosen to use her gifts in service of people who valued them, who understood that the ability to transform simple ingredients into sustenance was a form of artistry worthy of respect rather than casual dismissal. "I made soup for the homeless shelter twice a week," she continued, her tone factual rather than accusatory. "I work at Los Compadres, teaching the younger cooks traditional techniques their grandmothers knew, but they've forgotten. I volunteer at the senior center, making sure the old people have food that reminds them they're still valued, still seen." She paused, meeting his eyes directly for the first time that evening. "I do the same work I always did, Mr. Richardson. I feed people who are hungry. The difference is that now they say thank you." The simple statement carried more weight than any formal accusation could have managed. It wasn't anger in her voice, but a kind of weary wisdom, the understanding of someone who had learned to find her worth in her own work rather than in other people's recognition of it. James Richardson set down his spoon and looked at this woman he had so catastrophically misjudged. In his penthouse kitchen, surrounded by expensive appliances and elaborate ingredients, she had seemed like hired help, her contributions invisible against the backdrop of his wealth and status. But here, in this humble space, he could see what he had been blind to for 9 years. Maria was an artist, a teacher, a healer who used food as her medium for creating connection and comfort in a world that often provided neither. "I was wrong," he said finally, the words emerging with difficulty not because he didn't mean them, but because they were so inadequate to the magnitude of his mistake. "Not just about that night, though I was completely wrong about that. I was wrong about you, about the value of what you did, about—" He paused, struggling to find words for the recognition that was reshaping his understanding of his own life. "I was wrong about what makes food meaningful." Maria studied his face, reading sincerity, but also the limits of understanding that wealth and privilege had imposed on his ability to truly grasp what he had lost. "You weren't wrong about everything," she said quietly. "You were right that I took leftovers home sometimes. But not because I was stealing. Because waste is a sin, Mr. Richardson. When food is prepared with love, and there's more than needed, it's meant to be shared. My children ate your leftovers, yes, and they were grateful for every bite because they understood what you never learned. Food prepared with care carries love, no matter where it ends up." The revelation hit him like a physical blow. He had accused her of theft when she had been performing an act of stewardship, had seen greed where there had been the practical wisdom of someone who understood that abundance unused was abundance wasted. His children had literally eaten the love she poured into every meal, had been nourished not just by nutrition, but by care that extended beyond the walls of his house. "I want to make this right," he said, reaching for the language of business negotiation, because it was the only vocabulary he knew for repairing damage. "Whatever compensation you need, whatever references might help, whatever—" "Mr. Richardson," Maria's voice was gentle but firm, cutting through his attempts to solve with money a problem that transcended financial equation. "You can't buy forgiveness. You can't purchase redemption. You can't invest in making this right and expect guaranteed returns." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of a wealthy man discovering that his most powerful tool was useless for addressing his deepest need. James Richardson had built his fortune on the principle that everything had a price, that any problem could be solved through appropriate application of financial resources. But sitting in a community kitchen that operated on donated time and volunteer labor, He faced the revolutionary possibility that some things, dignity, respect, genuine human connection, existed outside the economic system he had mastered. Then what? He asked, his voice carrying the bewilderment of someone whose navigational systems had failed him completely. What can I do? Maria looked at him with something that wasn't quite pity, but wasn't forgiveness either. Perhaps it was simply recognition of someone beginning to understand the vast scope of what he didn't know. Learn, she said simply. Learn to see the people who serve you as human beings with stories and gifts and dignity that don't depend on your recognition. Learn to value work that nourishes hearts as much as work that accumulates wealth. Learn that saying thank you costs nothing but means everything. She stood and began gathering the bowls, preparing to wash them as she had washed thousands of dishes in his kitchen. But this time, the act felt different. Not servitude, but completion, the natural end to the cycle of preparation and nourishment and cleanup that gave structure to the ancient art of feeding others. There's a position opening at Los Compadres, she said without looking at him. Kitchen manager. They need someone who understands traditional techniques, who can teach younger cooks, who can help plan menus that honor the food traditions our families brought from Mexico. The pay is nothing compared to what you paid Louis. But the work matters. The people you feed know your name, thank you for your service, understand that what you do is art, not just labor. The offer hung in the air like an invitation to an alternate universe where his skills might serve purposes beyond self-enrichment, where his position might be earned through contribution rather than inheritance. James Richardson realized she wasn't just describing a job opportunity. She was offering him a chance to discover what his own work might feel like if it nourished something besides his bank account. Would you? He began, then stopped, uncertain how to ask someone he had wronged so deeply to consider working with him again in any capacity. Would I what? Maria asked, her hands never pausing in their work, but her attention clearly focused on his halting question. Would you consider coming back? The words emerged quietly, carrying hope and humility in equal measure. Not to work for us, but with us. As a partner, not an employee, to help create something different than what we had before. Maria dried the last bowl with careful attention, considering not just his offer, but the man who was making it, someone who had revealed himself capable of casual cruelty, but who seemed perhaps capable of genuine change as well. Ask me again in a year, she said finally, after you've learned some of the lessons I mentioned. After you've discovered whether you can value people who don't come with Michelin stars and culinary institute degrees. After you've figured out the difference between being served and being served with love. She hung up the towel with the precision of someone who honored every tool, no matter how humble, then turned to face him directly. But I'll make you a deal, Mr. Richardson. Come here once a week, not to apologize, not to negotiate, just to learn. Help serve meals to people who can't always pay for them. Listen to their stories. Understand what it means to be grateful for food prepared with care. Maybe if you do that long enough, we'll both discover whether redemption is possible. James Richardson nodded, understanding that he was being offered something far more valuable than forgiveness. He was being offered the chance to become someone worthy of it. Standing to leave, he paused at the community center door, looking back at Maria, who had already returned to her work, preparing for the next day's classes with the same quiet dedication she had brought to every task he had ever assigned her. Maria, he said, his voice carrying a question he wasn't sure he knew how to ask. In 9 years, did I ever really say thank you? She looked up from her preparations, her face holding memories of countless meals prepared, countless hours spent ensuring his family was nourished, countless small kindnesses offered without expectation of acknowledgement. No, Mr. Richardson, she said simply. You never did. The truth settled between them like a final accounting, a recognition of debt that couldn't be paid in money but might, possibly, be addressed through the slow, patient work of learning to see each other as fully human. It was, James Richardson realized as he stepped into the Chicago night, the beginning of the hardest and most important work of his life. Not accumulating wealth, but learning how to deserve the love that had always been offered freely by people he had been too blind to see. 6 months later, as Chicago's summer painted Lake Michigan in shades of blue that no amount of money could purchase, the Richardson penthouse kitchen hummed with a different kind of energy than it had known in years. The expensive molecular equipment was gone, donated to a culinary school where students could learn to transform Louis' complex techniques into art that nourished both body and soul. In their place stood simpler tools, well-seasoned cast-iron pans, wooden cutting boards worn smooth by countless meals, the molcajete that Maria had brought from her grandmother's kitchen in Mexico, its volcanic stone surface perfect for grinding spices into aromatic powder that carried generations of flavor wisdom. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, nor had it been purchased with the swift efficiency that characterized James Richardson's business dealings. Instead, it had grown slowly, organically, like the relationships that now filled the space with laughter and conversation and the kind of comfortable chaos that comes when cooking becomes collaboration rather than performance. Maria had returned not as an employee, but as a partner, her knowledge and James's resources combining to create something neither could have achieved alone. They had established the Richardson Vasquez Culinary Institute, a non-profit organization that taught cooking skills to unemployed workers, single mothers, recent immigrants, and anyone else who needed both practical skills and the dignity of work that mattered. The penthouse kitchen served as teaching space and testing ground for recipes that honored traditional techniques while addressing contemporary nutritional needs and budget constraints. The weekly classes brought together people who would never have met in Chicago's stratified social landscape. Hedge fund managers learning to make tamales alongside construction workers, tech entrepreneurs discovering the patience required for properly developed mole while working next to house cleaners whose knowledge of flavor transcended any culinary school curriculum. Maria taught with the same grace she had always brought to her work, but now her students included James Richardson, who arrived each Tuesday evening ready to learn lessons that his Harvard MBA had never covered. He proved to be a surprisingly willing student once his assumptions about the hierarchy of knowledge were dismantled. His hands, more accustomed to signing contracts worth millions than kneading masa for tortillas, gradually developed the calluses and gentle strength that came from working with food that demanded patience rather than speed, intuition rather than calculation. He learned that the best pozole couldn't be rushed, that perfect bread required understanding timing that had nothing to do with market schedules, that feeding others well was a form of wealth that multiplied through sharing rather than diminishing. Sophie had become the Institute's youngest instructor, teaching children's cooking classes where 8-year-olds learned that food could be both fun and meaningful, that cooking was a superpower that allowed them to take care of themselves and others, that kitchens were laboratories for creativity as much as spaces for necessary work. Her relationship with Maria had deepened beyond the student-teacher dynamic into something approaching the mother-daughter connection that had been lost when her own mother died years earlier. The changes extended beyond the kitchen into every corner of the Richardson family's relationships. Michael visited more frequently from New York, bringing his own children for classes where their grandmother's tamales recipe was passed down through hands that bridged generations and cultures. He had begun incorporating lessons about social responsibility into his investment strategy, using his Wall Street connections to direct capital toward businesses that created value for communities rather than simply extracting profit from them. Patricia had relocated her startup from San Francisco to Chicago, drawn by the opportunity to participate in the Institute's mission and by the desire to be closer to a family that had rediscovered how to nourish each other. Her technology background proved invaluable in developing online resources that made traditional cooking knowledge accessible to people who couldn't attend in-person classes, creating digital bridges between grandmother's wisdom and contemporary family needs. But the most profound transformation was in James Richardson himself, who discovered that the skills that made him successful in business, attention to detail, systematic thinking, persistence in the face of obstacles, could be applied toward purposes that created value beyond financial accumulation. His wealth remained vast, but it had begun flowing toward projects that multiplied abundance rather than concentrating it. Scholarships for culinary students who couldn't afford traditional programs, grants for community gardens and food deserts, investments in local restaurants that served as community gathering places rather than just profit centers. The dinner parties that had once showcased molecular gastronomy designed to impress business associates were replaced by community meals that brought together people from across Chicago's economic spectrum. The formal dining room with its intimidating crystal and silver was opened weekly for shared dinners where homeless individuals ate alongside millionaires, where conversation flowed in multiple languages, where success was measured by satisfaction and laughter rather than deal closure and network expansion. Maria had accepted a teaching position at the Institute that utilized her gifts fully while providing the respect and recognition that had been denied for so many years. Her salary, while modest compared to what Lewis had commanded, came with benefits that couldn't be quantified financially. The gratitude of students who discovered confidence through mastering traditional techniques, the satisfaction of preserving cultural knowledge that might otherwise be lost, the joy of working alongside people who valued her contributions rather than taking them for granted. The position at Los Compadres that she had mentioned during their first reconciliation conversation had evolved into a consulting role where she helped family restaurants throughout Chicago develop menus that honored their cultural traditions while meeting contemporary health and budget requirements. Her reputation in the city's food community had grown organically, built not on media attention or celebrity endorsements, but on the word-of-mouth recommendations of families whose lives had been improved by her teaching and guidance. On a Thursday evening in late August, as Chicago's humidity carried the mingled aromas of grilling food from neighborhood barbecues and the promise of autumn's approach, Maria stood in the penthouse kitchen preparing for another community dinner. The space buzzed with the familiar energy of collaborative cooking, James carefully monitoring a pot of beans that required the kind of patient attention that no amount of wealth could rush, Sophie teaching two teenagers how to properly season and roll empanadas, Patricia developing an app that would help families calculate nutritional content of traditional recipes modified for contemporary dietary needs. The scene represented everything that had been impossible a year earlier, when molecular equipment dominated the space and relationships were defined by economic roles rather than mutual respect. Now, the kitchen hummed with purpose that transcended the simple preparation of food, becoming a laboratory for community building, a classroom for life lessons, a sanctuary where different cultures and economic backgrounds could meet in the common language of nourishment and care. James looked up from his beans to find Maria watching him with an expression that mixed amusement at his continued fascination with timing that couldn't be hurried, and something deeper, perhaps not forgiveness, which remained a work in progress, but recognition that change was possible when it was approached with genuine humility and sustained commitment to learning. "How do they look?" he asked, gesturing toward the beans that had been simmering for hours, developing the kind of complex flavor that emerged only through patience and proper attention. "Almost ready," Maria replied, tasting the broth with the critical palate that had guided her through decades of cooking. "Maybe 15 more minutes. You're learning to listen to the food instead of trying to control it." The observation carried weight beyond culinary instruction, acknowledging growth that extended far beyond technique into fundamental approaches to relationship and responsibility. James had discovered that the skills that made him wealthy, the ability to identify value, to invest resources strategically, to persist through obstacles, could be applied toward purposes that created wealth that couldn't be measured in dollars, but was infinitely more satisfying. As they worked together preparing for an evening that would bring together people from across Chicago's economic spectrum, united by nothing more complex than the shared human need for nourishment and community, Maria reflected on the strange journey that had brought them from that November evening of cruel accusation to this August evening of collaborative creation. The path had been neither straight nor simple, requiring both of them to confront assumptions about worth and value that ran deeper than any single interaction. But perhaps the most important lesson, Maria thought, as she watched James stir beans with the careful attention of someone who had learned to value process as much as results, was that redemption, like good cooking, couldn't be rushed or purchased. It had to be earned through consistent daily practice, through the patient application of better principles, through the willingness to serve others without expectation of recognition or reward. The community dinner that evening drew nearly 50 people from neighborhoods across Chicago. Their differences in income and background dissolved in the shared experience of food prepared with care by hands that represented multiple generations and cultures working together. As plates circulated and conversations flowed in English and Spanish and the universal language of appreciation for nourishment offered with love, Maria understood that they had created something far more valuable than any molecular innovation. They had created authentic community, sustained by the ancient wisdom that feeding others well was both the simplest and most profound expression of human caring. And have you ever cooked for someone who never said thank you? Have you ever poured your heart into preparing food for people who saw your work as invisible, your contributions as expected, your care as something to be consumed without acknowledgement? Tell me in the comments about the kitchen where you've worked without recognition, the meals you've prepared without gratitude, the love you've offered through food that others took for granted. If this story touched something in your heart, if you recognized yourself in Maria's patient service or felt anger at the casual cruelty that wealth too often enables, leave a like and subscribe so this message reaches another woman who cooks with her soul, who feeds others before feeding herself, who understands that the most important ingredient in any meal is the love that guides the hands preparing it. The kitchens of the world are filled with women like Maria, whose contributions go unnoticed, whose artistry is dismissed as mere labor, whose gifts are valued less than the equipment they use to express them. But their work creates the foundation of human civilization, the daily miracle of transforming raw ingredients into sustenance, of channeling love into the most basic human need, of building community one shared meal at a time. For more heartfelt stories that honor the invisible heroes who sustain our daily lives, click the podcast link on the left. These are the stories of people whose work matters more than their recognition, whose contributions transcend their compensation, whose love feeds the world one meal at a time. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey through the landscape of home and heart, service and recognition, cruelty and redemption. Remember that every meal prepared with care is an act of love. Every thank you offered to those who serve is a recognition of their humanity, and every kitchen filled with laughter and cooperation is a small rebellion against a world too often divided by artificial hierarchies of worth. See you in the next story, where we'll continue exploring the rich emotional territory where human dignity meets daily work, where love finds expression through service, and where the smallest acts of recognition can transform both giver and receiver in ways that money cannot measure, but hearts will never forget.